Again, welcome. Good to see you. Some of you have been traveling the last few weeks and have made it home. And after spring break, I was kidding a couple of people that they took the warm weather we had with them to wherever they went. So hopefully they'll bring it back to us again. But anyway, if you use I'm going to just give you a warning. If you use the reflection questions from week to week, you might notice that there are a couple today that don't maybe quite make sense, and that's because when I did them earlier in the week, as the message unfolded, it didn't unfold quite the way I thought it did. So I will appreciate your indulgence in that. Over the last few weeks, I've thrown a couple of questions out for you to think about, like when you had perhaps been most terrified in your life. Another question was when you might have felt the most alone in your life. And this morning, the question I want to put before you as we start, one that's probably more uncomfortable and even frankly more intrusive, is what are you most ashamed of in your life? What are you most ashamed of? What is one thing about you or one thing that you have done that you would hope that no one ever finds out about? Shame is a tricky word. People will talk about the dangers of shaming someone, and for good reasons, almost always in a negative sense. But you know, there are things that we should be ashamed of. Because at its core, shame is basically a sense of distress or regret or disappointment at something that we know has been wrong. And let me suggest that if you show me a person who has no sense of shame, I would show you a person who probably has no conscience, no sense of right or wrong, of what is moral or immoral. We've been spending a lot of time over these last few weeks in Mark chapter 14, and we've seen for instance, Jesus share the last Passover meal with his disciples. We've seen him go into the Garden of Gethsemane and pray under so much stress that he was literally sweating drops of blood. We've seen everyone flee and abandon him as he was arrested. Everyone, that is, except for one person. Peter. And it's to Peter that we turn this morning. I'm going to invite you to open to Mark chapter 14. Next week we're going to flip back a few chapters. We're going to look at Mark 11 on Palm Sunday, and then we'll skip ahead to chapter 15 on Good Friday. But this morning we're going to finish out our look at chapter 14, starting at verse 66. Here's what Mark writes. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." And he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. And then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. I don't think I'm exaggerating it when I say that Peter's denial of Jesus, his disowning, of Jesus, as the NIV heading says, has to be the biggest failure of his life. Now, Jesus, of course, predicted it. Peter, as he was wont to do, protested, denied that it would happen. But there it is. The biggest failure of his life. Which raises a question for us. How do we respond to our own failures? How do we respond to our own failures? See if this sounds familiar. Where have you been? Out. Who were you with? Nobody. What were you doing? Nothing. Where have you been? Out. Who were you with? Nobody. What were you doing? Nothing. For many of us, our natural tendency, if we're honest, is to dismiss our failures. We'll try to minimize them. Other times we'll try to hide them, and still at other times we'll try to point the finger and blame someone else. If we go back to Genesis chapter 3 and the account of the fall, we see one way or another all three of those in play there. There's nothing new under the sun. Sin. Have you ever noticed how even Christians will often avoid the use of the word? Especially when it comes to themselves. I mean, we will talk about making mistakes. We will talk about, we've had a lapse of judgment. We'll use some other similarly innocuous term. All of ways of minimizing or even denying the reality of things. Genesis 6:5, though, and this is just one of many places in Scripture we get the same idea one way or another. Genesis 6:5 says, though, that every inclination of the human heart, which means every inclination of our hearts, is toward evil. It's what the reformers like John Calvin and Martin Luther called depravity. We don't like that word. Other people might be depraved. The people we read about in the newspaper, or we see on television, but we're not depraved. We're not sinners, at least not like some other people. But you know what? Denying the truth only makes things worse. It only makes things worse. There's a sense, and this is a little different angle on it, but there's a sense in which we see that with Peter. The truth is that Peter knew Jesus, he just wasn't going to admit it. He just wasn't going to admit it. And where does that lead? It leads on Peter's own kind of short-term downward spiral that ends with these last words of chapter 14, and then he broke down and wept. Matthew and Luke say he wept bitterly. Not just that he wept bitterly. And when I read that, I think of situations that sometimes we might find ourselves in. I know I have found myself in these situations. You maybe have too, where you are so overcome with emotion and you are crying so hard and so really uncontrollably that you can't stop crying. That is until your body just stops crying because it can't do it anymore. On the heels of these three denials, Peter is at the lowest point in his life. But there's something here we don't give Peter credit for. We look at, you denied Jesus 3 times. What's wrong with you? But think about this. All 4 gospel writers tell us about Peter's failure. All 4 of them. But the only one of the disciples that was actually there was Peter. So what does that suggest? That suggests that the person who told the story in the first place was Peter himself. He denied Jesus, but he didn't try in the end to deny that he had denied Jesus. He owned it. He was honest about it. And the question for us is, in our own failures, are we willing to be honest about them? Doesn't mean that we write about them, doesn't mean that we tell everyone about them, but are we willing to be honest about them? How do we respond to our own failure? Beyond that, how do we respond to the failures of others? This second question, I think, is unmistakably connected to the first. Remember what Peter said when Jesus first told him that Peter was going to deny him? Peter said, well, everybody else might do that, but not me. One of the ways that we will try to minimize or deny our own failures at times is by comparison. Comparing ourselves to others, comparing our little sins to someone else's greater sins. It's another way, frankly, of denying the truth of Genesis 6:5, Romans 3:23, that all have sinned. All, that includes me, it includes you, it includes us. All have sinned and fall short of what? The glory of God. Whenever we try to compare ourselves to someone else, whenever we do compare ourselves to someone else, we can always find some way to come out looking good. We can always do it. But when we compare ourselves, we compare our failure, our sin to God's perfection, it's a whole nother deal. We never come out looking good that way. You know, the natural tendency for all of us, and it's probably heightened by social media and everything that's available to us today, our natural tendency is to put ourselves in the best possible light. Unfortunately, oftentimes we fall into another trap, and that is to put other people's failures in the worst possible light. We've got a whole media culture that does that seeks to exploit the failures of others. And if we don't celebrate them, we are often at least intrigued by them. In some ways, the formula for a lot of people probably boils down to this, and we maybe don't realize it, but oftentimes we tend in this direction. Do everything we can to hide or deny our failures. And in certain circumstances, do everything we can to highlight or exploit someone else's. And to be brutally honest, if we think Christians are immune to that, we're not. We're not. So think back to how we view Peter at this particular moment in his life. I don't think I'm off base when we say, I honestly can't understand how Peter could do that. And probably to borrow a line from him, say, well, we would never do that. If the chips were down, we would certainly stand with Jesus. But thinking back to last week in particular, and the various ways that we can ourselves fall away, would we stand firm? We certainly would like to think that we would. Third question, and I think this is actually the most important of the three questions. How does God respond to failure? How does God respond to failure? Now, one of the things that's interesting in Mark's writing is that there are places in which he's not afraid to leave things hanging. He's not afraid to leave some tension unresolved. And this is one of those places. He tells about Peter's denial and then the anguish that Peter feels, and then he just moves on. Luke does much the same thing. He does much the same thing. After Peter's denied Jesus a third time, just as the rooster is crowing, he adds this. He says that at that moment, Jesus turned and looked straight at Peter. Now, he doesn't tell us if that was a look of pain or of disappointment or of some sort of judgment or condemnation. He just says that at that moment, as the rooster is crowing the second time, Jesus turns and looks straight at him. And I have to suspect that that was a look that Peter never forgot. But the look and the weeping were not the end. And Mark hints at that in chapter 16, verse 7, which we'll come to in a couple of weeks. He hints at it after the resurrection. He says, when the angel says, go and tell the disciples and Peter that I will meet them. But that's about all he does. John goes into much more detail about Peter's restoration. But why is it that Peter, what does he experience after the failure? What does he experience after Jesus has looked straight at him and that rooster has crowed and he has collapsed, weeping? He experiences grief, to be sure, but grief that is replaced by grace. Let's go back for a moment to Genesis chapter 6. Moses tells us the truth about ourselves, that every inclination of the heart is only toward evil. But he goes on to tell about the effect of that on God. And I think there's something that's easy for us to skip over. We know that sin had increased and the earth had become a horrible place to live. And so what does God do? He floods all of creation. There's something that's easy for us to miss there. In verse 6, though, Moses says this: the Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. Now, I have to be careful there. I don't think Moses is saying that God was grieved that he had actually created humans. He was grieved at what we have become because of sin. Mixed with the anger over sin is pain, deep emotional anguish. His heart was filled with pain. And we think back to Peter's grief at his denial of Jesus and collapsing in tears. I don't think it even begins to compare to the grief that God feels himself, not only over Peter's failure, but our failure. Is he angry at sin? Yes, he has to be angry at sin. But beyond that, there's this deep grief. And those of us who are parents, we know the pain that we feel when our kids pursue things that we know they shouldn't pursue. God knows that grief much better than we do. Peter experienced grief. But he also experienced grace, and it is grace that is front and center in these last tumultuous hours of Jesus' life as he is going to the cross. Grace is front and center. Think about John 3:17, not 3:16, but 3:17, where John says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." What's God's deepest response to our failure, to our sin, to ours and everyone else's? It's grief. Deep grief. And it is abundant grace. It is abundant grace. So as we think about Peter and we think about his experience there during Jesus' arrest and trial, as we think about all this today, what do we need from Peter's experience? What do you need from Peter's experience? If you're like me, you probably need more than one thing. Do you, do I, do we perhaps need a warning? I said that Mark often will, or at least at times, will leave things hanging. And I don't think it's because he's a careless writer. I think he's doing it for effect. He's doing it to get our attention. And one of those things could be a warning. Last week we talked about some of the ways that that people fall away, including things like distractions, which, as I suggested, is probably the biggest issue for most of us. All the things that can take our attention away from Jesus and following Jesus. And these are often good things. These are often good things and necessary things. Things like work and family and entertainment and sports and any number of things. They're good things. But every one of them has the potential to become an idol if we're not careful. All of us, like Peter, will say, couldn't happen to me. Couldn't be me. But as one of my Bethel profs always used to say, the moment that we think it can't happen to us, we become the most vulnerable people in the world. And I wouldn't be surprised if part of the reason that Mark leaves us hanging the way he does is as a warning. But it could also be an appeal. Could also be an appeal. Last week when we talked about ways we can fall away, we also talked about danger and disappointment and doubt. And Mark's first readers lived where following Jesus was dangerous. They were feeling constant pressures to their faith. And there are some who believe that that Mark left things hanging here not as a warning, but as an appeal, as an encouragement even. Maybe that's a better word, as an encouragement. As if he was saying, folks, even Peter, even Peter failed. Even Peter failed, but he endured. He came back. He was restored. You can do the same. And I have to say that sometimes, at least for me, maybe for you as well, sometimes it's the endurance that we see in people rather than their obvious outright successes that is the most inspiring. Third possibility. Do you need a promise? Do you need a promise? Do you need the promise that however grievous your own failure may be, whatever it is that you hope no one will ever find out about or never know, do you need the promise that as much as God grieves over that, there is grace, there is abundant grace? Grace to overcome it. Do you need the promise that if you're willing to own it, whatever it is, that if you're willing to own it, that the shame that you feel or could feel is no match for the forgiveness that God offers through Jesus Christ? Jesus, the Scripture says, is our atoning sacrifice. He is the one who has taken our sin and removed it from us. He is the one who has reconciled us to God. And the good news of the gospel is that as grievous as our sin may be, as shameful as what we have done, thought, or might do could be, the grace of God extended to us in Jesus Christ through his shed blood and his broken body outstrips it all. And that is indeed good news. Would you pray with me? Lord, every one of us has something. Every one of us has many things for which we are ashamed or could be ashamed. And yet, Lord, you do not want us to live in that shame. Instead, Lord, you sent your Son not to condemn us or to condemn anyone else or to condemn the world, but to redeem us through his body and blood, his broken body and his shed blood. Lord, as we come to the table this morning, I would ask that we would be able to be honest about our need for what we celebrate here. That we would not that we would not resist the truth of who we are as fallen, sinful human beings. That we would not reject that truth, that we would accept it, but Lord, more than that, that we would accept and live into the reality that by Jesus' wounds we are healed. And so, Lord, as we prepare to come to the table this morning, I ask that you would, in these few moments, allow us the opportunity, if there are things that we know that are not right, that have not been dealt with. Lord, if it's something that has been dealt with a long time ago, don't let Satan trip us up over that. But Lord, if there's something we know that we have not dealt with, some way that we have denied you, either passively or actively, some way in which we have fallen away ourselves, Lord, enable us to acknowledge that before you now.